What if the man who saved the American Revolution was never supposed to be there in the first place? What if the general who turned the tide of a war was someone the army had already thrown away? Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, I am glad you found us. And I hope you will stick around because today we are diving into one of the most remarkable and underappreciated stories in all of American history. If you have been here before, you already know what we do, and I want to say thank you for coming back. It genuinely means everything. If you have not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button now, because stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists. Now, here is what I want you to think about before we go any further. In the spring of 1777, one of the finest combat officers in the Continental Army walked away from the war. He did not defect. He did not run. He simply refused to serve a system that rewarded political connections over blood spilled on the battlefield. He packed up, went home to his farm, and most people assumed they would never hear from him again. 5 months later, those same people watched him ride back into the fight with nearly 1,500 farmers, blacksmiths, and woodsmen behind him. No uniforms, no formal training. Just men who trusted one leader enough to follow him into a fight against professional European soldiers. And on a blazing hot August afternoon in 1777, that ragtag force did something that shook the entire war. They did not just win. They destroyed 2 full detachments of some of the most disciplined troops on Earth, and in doing so, they set in motion a chain of events that brought France into the war on America's side and made the Revolution's final victory possible. The general who quit came back and won one of the most important battles of his era. And the story of how that happened, and what it cost him to get there, starts not on any battlefield, but in the wilderness of colonial New Hampshire, with a 23-year-old trapper, a frozen riverbank, and a war party he never saw coming. To understand why this man fought the way he did, you have to go back to who he was before the Revolution ever started. Because the qualities that made him walk away from the Continental Army in 1777 were the same qualities that were forged into him decades earlier, in the wilderness, through experiences that would have broken most men completely. In the spring of 1752, he was 23 years old, out on a fur-trapping expedition along the Baker River in the White Mountains of New Hampshire with his older brother, a neighbor, and a close friend. They had been out for weeks and had collected a remarkable haul, furs worth somewhere around 560 pounds sterling. That was serious money on the colonial frontier. But as April wore on, they started seeing signs that Abenaki warriors were moving through the area. The smart move was to pack up and leave, and that is exactly what they started doing. On the evening of April 28th, he was alone on the riverbank, pulling in the last trap, when he looked up and found himself completely surrounded by 10 to 12 armed warriors. They asked him where his companions were. He pointed in the wrong direction. That single act of defiance, that refusal to give up the people he cared about, even when staring down the barrels of loaded muskets, tells you almost everything you need to know about this man's character. His friend David Stinson was shot and killed. His neighbor Amos Eastman was captured. But his older brother William managed to escape downstream in a canoe because he had bought him the time to do it. The warriors beat him for that. He did not care. Over the following weeks, they marched him and Eastman roughly 300 miles north into Canada to their village near Quebec. When they arrived, both captives were forced to run the gauntlet. 2 lines of young warriors stood armed with clubs and heavy sticks, and the captive had to run between them while they swung. Eastman went first. He stumbled and fell and barely made it through alive. And here is where the story takes a turn that tells you exactly who this man was. According to the memoirs later written by his own grandson, he did not run. Instead, he grabbed a long pole with an animal skin tied to one end, stepped into that gauntlet, and started swinging back. He gave as good as he got and turned the whole ceremony into absolute chaos. The older members of the tribe watched this spectacle and started laughing. The chief was so impressed by his defiance that he adopted both young men into the tribe and gave him a name that translated to the young chief. He spent several months living among the Abenaki, learning their language, their customs, and most importantly, their way of moving through and fighting in wilderness terrain. He would later say that the Abenaki treated prisoners of war with more genuine kindness than he had ever seen from any so-called civilized nation. In the spring of 1753, colonial agents ransomed both men. He was released for 103 Spanish dollars. His companion went for 60, but what he carried back with him was worth far more than what was paid for him. He came home with wilderness survival skills, guerrilla fighting instincts, and a deep, permanent respect for the people who had captured him. That respect would be tested soon enough. In 1755, the French and Indian War ignited across the frontier, and he enlisted alongside a fellow frontiersman named Robert Rogers, joining one of the most legendary, irregular military units in colonial American history, Rogers Rangers. These men were scouts and raiders and guerrilla fighters who operated deep in the forests and mountains between British and French lines, running reconnaissance missions, ambushing supply columns, and surviving in conditions that would have killed conventional soldiers outright. He thrived in this world and rose quickly through the ranks. And then came January 1757, a frozen lake, and a moment that almost nobody today remembers, but that defined him as a warrior just as surely as anything that came later. On January 21st, deep in the wilderness near Fort Carillon on Lake Champlain, Rogers led a scouting party of 74 Rangers into a brutal ambush. Rogers himself was wounded twice, once in the head and once in the hand. He was at the rear of the column when the attack began, and without hesitation, he established a defensive line on a small rise, directing covering fire to protect the men falling back toward his position. When darkness finally ended the fighting, he led the survivors on a march through the frozen night. And then he did something that speaks directly to the kind of man he was. He walked alone through snow 4 feet deep, covering 40 miles to reach Fort William Henry, so he could bring back sleds to carry out the wounded. He did not ask someone else to go. He went himself. Now, there is something I want you to understand before we move forward, because this next part of the story is where most people lose the thread. The American Revolution was not just a war fought against the British. It was also a war fought against something far more familiar and far more frustrating, which was a system that rewarded the wrong people. And this man was about to walk straight into that system and get burned by it in a way that would change the course of everything. But before that happened, he had one more chapter to write in the French and Indian War. In 1759, Rogers Rangers received orders to attack the Abenaki village at St. Francis, the very same village where he had been held captive, the very same community where people who had shown him genuine kindness still lived. He was the unit's second in command. He refused to go. He resigned and went home to New Hampshire. Some people have called that decision cowardice. I would call it something else entirely. I would call it the clearest possible expression of a man who had decided that there were lines he simply would not cross, no matter who gave the order. The Rangers carried out the attack without him, and the results were ugly. Around 30 people were killed at the village, most of them women and children. On the march back, Abenaki warriors tracked the Rangers through the wilderness and killed nearly 50 of them. He had walked away from both the order and the consequences that followed it. He went home, married a woman everyone called Molly, settled into the quiet life of a farmer and sawmill operator, and for the next 16 years, the frontier's most dangerous soldier raised his family and tended his land. He was done with war. And then came April 1775. Word reached him that British soldiers had fired on colonists at Lexington and Concord. He did not wait for orders. He did not wait for a commission or a formal appointment or anyone's permission. According to his own account, he retrieved his musket, mounted his horse, and rode toward the fighting, just like that. His neighbors fell in behind him as he rode, and within weeks, he was commanding the largest American regiment outside of Boston, a force of hardened New Hampshire men who would follow him anywhere. The first real test came on the 17th of June, 1775, at the battle that history would record as Bunker Hill, though the fighting actually took place on Breed's Hill due to a confusion in orders. I want to pause here and give you the detail that separates what happened that day from a simple defensive battle, because what he did on that peninsula was not reactive. It was anticipatory, and that distinction matters enormously. He was assigned to defend the northern flank along the Mystic River beach, and the moment he surveyed that position, he recognized something that no one else had seen. British General William Howe was known for his aggressive and highly effective use of light infantry flanking maneuvers. He had fought against Howe's tactics before. He understood exactly how Howe's mind worked, and he knew that the narrow strip of beach along the Mystic River was the most dangerous vulnerability on the entire American line. So while others focused on the redoubt on the hill, he put his men to work building a stone and rail fence breastwork that extended all the way from the existing defensive line down to the water line itself. Nobody else thought to do this, not one other officer on that field. And then, as his men were finishing that work and preparing for what was coming, he did something that has stayed with me every time I have read about this battle. He walked out in front of the position, alone, and drove a single wooden stake into the ground in the sand, roughly 40 yards in front of the wall. That stake was his fire control line. His order to his men was simple and absolute. Do not fire until they reach that stake. Not a second before. Now here is what happened next, and I want you to picture this clearly. Around 350 British light infantrymen, among the finest soldiers in the world at that moment, came charging down that narrow beach, packed 4 and 5 men across, moving fast, and expecting to sweep around the American flank with ease. His men were arranged in 3 ranks using the continuous fire technique he had learned during his years with Rogers Rangers. The first rank knelt, the second crouched behind them, the third stood. Each rank fired in rotation, creating a wall of lead that never stopped. They loaded their muskets with buck and ball, meaning 4 pieces of buckshot packed alongside every single musket ball, which effectively multiplied the killing power of each shot. The British charged 3 times. 3 times, they were cut to pieces. When the surviving soldiers finally broke and ran, they left 96 of their dead on the sand. Every single one of those casualties fell in the space between that wooden stake and the wall behind it. That is how disciplined his men were. That is how completely he had anticipated and prepared for what was coming. His regiment was the last American unit to leave the battlefield that day, and British General John Burgoyne, watching the entire engagement from across the harbor in Boston, wrote that the American retreat was not a flight, and that it was covered with bravery and military skill. Coming from the enemy, that is about as high a compliment as a soldier can receive. After Bunker Hill, he continued to serve with distinction, joining the failed American invasion of Canada and then marching south to fight alongside George Washington in New Jersey. On the freezing night of the 25th of December, 1776, he crossed the Delaware River with Washington for the surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, the battle that saved the Continental Army from total collapse. Then came Princeton a few days later. By the time that brutal winter campaign ended, he had fought in more major engagements than almost any other officer in the entire Continental Army. He had earned everything that was coming to him, and what came to him next was a betrayal so clean and so complete that it changed the direction of the whole war. In early 1777, the Continental Congress promoted several officers to the rank of brigadier general. His name was not on the list. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the injustice here is not subtle. This was a man who had fought at Bunker Hill, who had crossed the Delaware in the dead of winter, who had bled through 2 wars and dozens of engagements. And Congress looked at his record and decided that someone else deserved the promotion more. That someone else was a New Hampshire colonel who had not even marched his militia to Bunker Hill when the fighting broke out. In his view, this man had refused to fight while he and his soldiers were holding the line under some of the most murderous fire of the entire war. And now that same man outranked him. Here is what I find most fascinating about this moment, and it is something that the history books rarely put side by side. At exactly the same time, another brilliant combat officer was receiving the exact same insult from the exact same Congress. His name was Benedict Arnold. Arnold had captured Fort Ticonderoga. He had fought brilliantly at Valcour Island. He had bled for this cause as much as any man alive, and Congress passed him over for promotion in favor of officers with better political connections and far less combat experience. George Washington himself wrote to Arnold and said he was surprised not to see his name on the list. Both men were furious. Both men felt the full weight of that betrayal. And what each of them did next is one of the most instructive contrasts in all of American military history. But we will come back to that in a moment, because right now I want to stay with the man who chose a different path. On the 23rd of March 1777, he resigned his commission from the Continental Army. Some of his fellow officers tried to talk him out of it. He did not budge. But before he left, he made one thing absolutely clear. He told them that if a British threat came from the direction of Canada and endangered New Hampshire, he would be ready to meet it. He was going home, but he was not abandoning the cause. He was simply refusing to serve it on terms that he found beneath his dignity and beneath the dignity of every soldier who had ever bled for it. And so he went back to his farm in Derryfield and he waited. He did not have to wait long. That summer, a massive British army under General John Burgoyne came pouring south out of Canada, driving toward Albany, New York, with thousands of British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, Loyalist militia, and Native American allies. Burgoyne's plan was to cut the American colonies in half by seizing control of the Hudson River Valley. The force seemed almost unstoppable. But Burgoyne had a problem that was getting worse by the day. His supply lines were stretched dangerously thin, and his army was running low on horses, food, and equipment. When he learned that the Americans were holding a supply depot at Bennington, Vermont, he made a decision that would ultimately cost him everything. He sent a raiding force to seize it. The man he chose to lead that force was Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum, a Hessian officer commanding a mixed detachment of around 670 soldiers, including Brunswick dragoons who had been dismounted because they had no horses, British regulars, Loyalist volunteers, Canadian militia, and a contingent of Native American scouts. Baum also had 2 small cannons. Burgoyne expected this to be quick. He had been told the depot was lightly defended, and he had no reason to believe otherwise. What nobody in that British camp knew was that the man they should have feared most had already heard the call. When the New Hampshire Provincial Congress asked him to come back and defend the state, he accepted on one condition, and it was non-negotiable. He would not answer to the Continental Army's command structure. He would not take orders from Congress or from any general Congress had appointed. He would fight this battle his way, on his terms, answering only to New Hampshire. They agreed without hesitation. And what happened next was something that even experienced military observers found almost impossible to believe. In the space of just 6 days, he assembled nearly 1,500 militia men. To put that in perspective, that was more than 10% of every male over the age of 16 in the entire state of New Hampshire. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and blacksmiths and tanners and woodsmen. Most of them wore their everyday clothes. They carried their own personal hunting rifles and muskets. They did not march in neat formations, and they did not look like an army. But they trusted this one man completely, and every single one of them knew how to shoot. On the road to Bennington, he received yet another reminder of exactly why he had resigned in the first place. General Benjamin Lincoln, the very officer whose promotion over him had triggered his resignation months earlier, attempted to assert Continental Army authority over him and his men. He refused, flatly and without apology. He answered to New Hampshire and to no one else. And with that settled, he marched his farmers toward a fight that would determine whether the American Revolution lived or died. Now, before the battle even began, he did something that most militia commanders never would have thought to do, and it speaks directly to the kind of strategic mind this man carried with him everywhere he went. While both sides sat waiting through a full day of heavy rain on August 15th, with the ground turning to mud and the rivers running high, he used every hour of that delay to plan one of the most sophisticated attacks ever executed by a force of civilian volunteers. He sent his own spies directly into the enemy camp. These men posed as loyalists, swore loyalty oaths, and were issued cards by the Germans to identify them as friendly forces. The Hessian soldiers spoke no English and had simply been told not to fire on anyone holding those cards, which meant that Stark's intelligence operatives were walking freely through the enemy position, counting guns and mapping defenses, while Baum genuinely believed they were on his side. The plan that emerged from those rain-soaked hours of preparation was a double envelopment, an attack from multiple directions simultaneously. 200 men would circle to the right to strike Baum's rear. 300 would swing around to the left. Another 200 would move against the Loyalist position. 100 men would launch a feint against the main fortification to hold Baum's attention. And then the full main body would drive straight up the center. On the morning of August 16th, the rain stopped and the sun came out. He looked at his men and delivered what multiple historical accounts describe as one of the most memorable battle speeches of the entire revolution. He pointed toward the enemy position and told his troops that those were the Redcoats and Tories and that they were theirs, or that night Molly Stark sleeps a widow. At around 3 in the afternoon on the 16th of August, 1777, the attack began. And what followed was not a clean, textbook engagement. It was brutal, chaotic, and deeply personal in the way that only close-quarters combat can be. His flanking parties hit Baum's position from both sides at almost exactly the same moment. The Loyalist troops crumbled first. Then the Native American scouts, reading the battlefield the way experienced warriors do, melted into the surrounding woods. That left Baum's Hessians fighting hard from behind their log and earthen fortifications, surrounded and outnumbered, but not yet broken. The fighting closed to point-blank range. Men fired muskets directly into each other's faces, and then came together with bayonets and swords and musket butts. One American soldier tried to take a Hessian prisoner, but his musket misfired at the critical moment. The two men grappled until he managed to draw the German's own sword. The Hessian broke free and ran, only to be clubbed to death by another American soldier nearby. That first soldier was genuinely upset about it. He had wanted a prisoner, not a corpse. That small detail tells you more about the raw, personal intensity of that afternoon than any casualty figure ever could. Baum himself was mortally wounded during the assault. His position collapsed, and the man who had organized all of this would later describe it as the hottest engagement he had ever witnessed in his life, resembling, in his own words, a continuous clap of thunder. But the battle was not over, and this is the part of the story where everything nearly came apart. Just as his men were finishing off Baum's force, Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Bremen arrived on the field with roughly 640 fresh reinforcements and 2 6-pound cannons. His militia was exhausted, scattered, and running low on ammunition. If those fresh professional troops had hit them at that moment, the entire outcome of the day could have reversed itself completely. And then came what I can only describe as one of those moments in history where timing becomes destiny. At almost exactly the same instant that Bremen arrived, Colonel Seth Warner appeared with 350 Continental soldiers from the Green Mountain Boys. Warner's men slammed into Bremen's column, and the battle erupted all over again. He rallied his tired, hungry militia and threw them back into the fight alongside Warner's Continentals. For another 2 hours, the guns did not stop. By nightfall, Bremen's force was shattered. The Germans retreated under cover of darkness, abandoning their cannons and leaving their dead and wounded behind on the field. Now let me give you the numbers, because I think they deserve to be heard clearly. The British and Hessian forces suffered around 207 killed and roughly 700 captured. His force lost approximately 30 killed and 40 wounded. In a single afternoon, a general who was not even technically part of the Continental Army had led a force of volunteer farmers to completely destroy 2 full detachments of professional European soldiers. The supplies Burgoyne had desperately needed never reached him. The men he lost could not be replaced, and the blow to morale inside his army was enormous. Burgoyne would later write to his superiors in London that the New Hampshire grants, and I am paraphrasing here, abounded in the most active and most rebellious race on the continent and hung like a gathering storm on his left. That is a British general describing the men who had just dismantled his invasion, and even in defeat, he could not hide his respect for them. The impact on the broader war was immediate and cascading. When Burgoyne continued his march south toward Saratoga, our commander moved his brigade into a position that would become known as Stark's Knob, a piece of high ground that blocked Burgoyne's only practical line of retreat northward toward Lake George and Lake Champlain. The British general was trapped on all sides. On the 17th of October, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, all 5,895 soldiers, representing 86% of the expeditionary force that had marched so confidently out of Canada just months earlier. It was the first time in the war that a complete British army had laid down its arms, and when news of that surrender reached France, King Louis XVI made his decision. France signed a formal alliance with the United States, bringing French money, French soldiers, and the French Navy into the conflict. That alliance changed everything. Without Saratoga, there is no French alliance. Without Bennington, there is almost certainly no Saratoga. And without one farmer general who refused to accept an unjust system and came back on his own terms, none of it happens the way it did. Now, I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier, because I think it is one of the most profound contrasts in the entire history of this war. Benedict Arnold and this man were both brilliant combat commanders. Both were passed over by the same Congress in favor of men who did not deserve the rank. Arnold let that bitterness consume him from the inside out. He turned traitor, attempted to hand West Point over to the British, and his name became a synonym for betrayal that Americans still use to this day. Our man got just as angry, maybe angrier, but he never turned against the cause he had fought for. He came back when it counted and fought harder than he ever had before. Same insult, same wound, completely different outcomes. And I think that difference says something important, not just about who these two men were, but about the choices that define what a person actually stands for when the cost of integrity becomes real. Congress finally acknowledged what he had done. In October 1777, they promoted him to brigadier general in the Continental Army, and he accepted. He continued to serve through the remaining years of the war, commanding the Northern Department 3 separate times. In 1780, he sat on the board of 13 general officers that convicted British Major John Andre, the spy who had helped Arnold plan the surrender of West Point. He was present for one of the ugliest betrayals of the entire conflict, and he helped deliver the judgment. When the Treaty of Paris ended the war in 1783, Congress promoted him to Major General. He resigned his commission on the 3rd of November 1783 and went home to Derryfield for the last time. He was 55 years old. He had survived capture, 2 wars, political betrayal, and some of the deadliest fighting of his era. And what he did next says as much about his character as anything that came before it. He farmed. He ran his sawmill. He raised his family. He never ran for office. He never sought public attention. Historians have noted that of all the generals of the American Revolution, he was the only one who truly and completely retired from public life. A genuine American Cincinnatus, the Roman general who saved the Republic and then quietly returned to his plow. He outlived his wife Molly, who passed in 1814. He outlived nearly every officer he had ever served alongside. Washington had died in 1799. Most of the other generals were gone within years of the war's end. He just kept going, year after year, on his farm in Manchester, watching the country he had helped build, grow, and change around him. In 1809, a group of veterans organized a celebration to commemorate the anniversary of Bennington. They wrote to him, then 81 years old, and invited him to attend. He was too old and too frail to make the journey. But he sent them a letter, and at the end of that letter, he included a toast that he asked them to read aloud on his behalf. The words he chose were these: "Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils." Those were not the words of a man performing patriotism for an audience. Those were the words of someone who had run a gauntlet and fought back, who had defended a beach when no one else thought to do it, who had crossed a frozen river in the dead of winter, who had quit on principle and returned when his homeland needed him, who had rallied farmers against the finest professional soldiers in the world and won. At the end of his life, he had boiled all of it down to 7 words: The state of New Hampshire made those words its official motto in 1945, and from 1970 onward, they have appeared on every non-commercial license plate in the state. They are there right now, on cars driving through Manchester and Concord and every small town in New Hampshire, carrying the distilled philosophy of a man most Americans have never heard of. He died on the 8th of May, 1822, at the age of 93, the last surviving general of the American Revolution. His remains were buried with full military honors on his own farm in Manchester, the same town he had lived in since he was 8 years old, the same place he had always come back to. A company of light infantry fired 3 volleys over his grave. And somewhere in the story of those volleys, I think, is everything you need to know about what it means to serve something larger than yourself without losing yourself in the process. After the war, he named his horse Hessian. That is exactly the kind of man he was. If this story moved you the way it moves me every time I come back to it, do me a favor and hit subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. Drop a like on this video and let me know in the comments which overlooked figure from American history you think deserves their own deep dive. I read every single one of those comments, and the best suggestions become future episodes.